I came into this world in Japan sometime around the 1750s. The very first thing that greeted me wasn't a lullaby or a smile. It was the sight of a midwife whose hands were stained black with charcoal powder. That was the custom back then, a ritual to welcome a newborn. "Welcome to the world, boy," they must have thought. I was born in a swordsmith's home, where fire and steel ruled over everything. The life of a swordmaker is a strange one. It's all about heat, hammering, and endurance. My destiny was sealed in metal long before I ever took my first breath. While other infants were lulled to sleep by soft songs, the first rhythm I ever knew was the sharp, steady ringing of my father's hammer striking steel. The sound carried through the thin paper walls of our home like a heartbeat. His heartbeat, my heartbeat, the heartbeat of fate itself. Our house stood close to the forge, half buried in the smoke that never seemed to clear. It looked almost like a scar on the land, something earned through suffering. When my father passed, the neighbors bowed deeply out of respect, but as they turned away, they quietly made a sign to ward off evil. The family of a swordsmith, they said, was both blessed and cursed, touched by divine skill, but haunted by the spirits trapped within the blades they forged. People whispered that each sword held a soul that never found peace. Maybe that's why I could never stay away from the fire. Even as a child, I was drawn to it, the heat, the sparks, the sound of the hammer hitting steel. Called to me like something alive, something in my blood. My first words weren't mother or father. They were words for metal, iron, steel. The curse, as people called it, had already taken root inside me before I even knew what it meant. Childhood? I'm not sure I ever really had one. While other kids around 5 years old played with wooden toys, I was stacking lumps of charcoal in neat lines, sorting them by size. My playground was the workshop, filled with molten metal and flashes of fire. I learned to slip between the flames and shadows like a ghost, quiet and fast, because if I startled my father at the wrong moment, he could lose his rhythm, ruin his work, and spend weeks fixing a single mistake. Every day was labor. I swung the hammer until my arms trembled, carried heavy sacks of charcoal until my back ached, and scrubbed the soot-covered floor until my knees bled. Other children were learning poetry. I was learning the language of metal. Steel, I discovered, had its own kind of voice. Metal with more carbon rang bright and clear, like a temple bell. Too little and it sounded dull and wet, like hitting rotten wood. The neighborhood kids used to call me Kamuro, Smoke Boy, sometimes Chibi Smoke. They'd shout it and scatter whenever I came near, afraid of the black dust and the burnt smell that always clung to me. Charcoal and fire were my constant companions. My clothes were always scorched, my hair singed short by flying sparks. I didn't have friends, just the forge, the glowing heart of the world I belonged to, and the quiet understanding that this was my life. Always would be. Formal training began with what my father called purification. He made me drink mountain water so cold it felt like knives in my chest, until my hands turned numb. For 3 days, I sat and listened, to the hum of the earth, to the stillness around me. Then, I washed my hands, lifted them to the sky, and focused my mind. My father used to say, "An impure heart forges impure steel." To him, swordsmithing wasn't just work. It was worship. So I became like a monk of the forge. My first lessons were brutal. I spent hours chopping scrap metal, heating it until it glowed red, pounding it, folding it, pounding again, over and over until my muscles screamed for mercy. If I made a mistake, there was no dinner waiting for me that night. Every day felt like a sentence, like a quiet, burning prison. I wake before dawn, every morning. 14 hours of shaping metal with deliberate force. There's no romance to it, just steady, controlled violence. At night, I collapse onto a straw mat that still breathes smoke, and I sleep like a stone. Mornings start with stoking the fire and sweeping away the ash. The air is full of metal dust that gets in your lungs no matter how you try to avoid it, and the coughing never really stops. By the time I'm 10, I can tell what weather's coming just from how the ash settles. It's a skill born of paying attention to tiny things. When I'm 11, I learn what a real burn is. Molten steel spits onto my forearm and melts the skin. There are scars that won't fade, like old tears. I howl for maybe 30 seconds, and my father slaps me hard to shut me up. That's how we learn here. Steel doesn't teach gently. Teaches with pain. My father's a strict man. He growls, and the smart boys keep their mouths shut and their hands steady. Those scars become my calling card. Proof that I've survived what most folks never would. Each mark on my skin is a lesson stamped into me. By 13, people start to say I'm worth something, worth handling real work. That's when they hand you the precious stuff. The tamahagane, the sacred steel taken from the Tatara furnace. The first time it's placed in my hand it trembles. I'm trembling too. One slip, one wrong fold, and you can ruin a sword and haunt your family for generations. So you do the work over and over, heat, fold, weld, fold again, 12 cycles maybe, sometimes more. It's not about hitting a number for the sake of it. It's about getting the carbon even and bringing out the grain you want. Heat it to the right color, strike it without shattering the edges, fold it straight and true. My father watches every move. He keeps a bamboo rod nearby, part correction, part warning, ready to remind you with pain if you falter. Then there are accidents you can't plan for. Once, a chisel, know me, slips, and it tears my palm open. Blood splashes onto hot steel and sizzles. The shouting stops in an instant. My blood and the metal mix, and my dad says something I'll never forget. Every sword carries some part of the maker. It sounds poetic when he says it, but I learned the darker truth too. Making blades means shedding blood, sometimes for decades, in service of your craft. The worst part, hands down, is the burn. After weeks of grinding and shaping, the blade's fate is decided in a single moment, the quench. You watch the steel glow in the dark furnace, judge the color, then plunge the tip into water. Get the angle or the viscosity wrong and the blade will warp or crack. It's a tiny window with enormous consequences. When the quench goes right, the sound of everything else fades. There's this rush, this relief. The first successful quench feels better than any kiss I never had. At least the blade doesn't run away. The tears after the first failure are worse than any grief I'd imagined. Like watching something die slow. I don't refine the steel myself from, or that's done at the refinery. What I get is already judged and sent based on its properties. How it cracks, how hard it is. They tune it before it even reaches my anvil. That's where the real craft begins. The fine-tuning of carbon and texture before forging. Every step can destroy the whole thing. Every choice can mean a samurai's life or death. There's a secret technique my father uses, a dense, leaden motion across the shoulder of the blade. Something that binds the grain together. You do it wrong and there's nothing left to fix. You do it right and you've made something that lasts. The next step in forging a blade is part science, part prayer. I coat it with a thin layer of clay, water, charcoal, and crushed stone. Just a whisper along the edge, thicker along the spine. That thin coat decides everything. One wrong stroke, and the blade you've labored over for weeks will fall apart in seconds. After that, I rough out the shape, polish the base, and brace myself for the final reveal. Then comes the sharpener's work. It takes him weeks, sometimes months, to uncover what lies hidden inside the steel. The grain, the spirit, the character of the blade. When it finally appears under the whetstone, it's like watching moonlight captured inside metal. The hamon, the blade's line, shimmers quiet as a spring blossom. That kind of beauty can take decades to learn how to repeat. For a brief moment, I understand obsession. Then, reality catches up with me. By the time I'm 20, my body's already wearing down. My hands ache constantly. My lungs wheeze from years of smoke, and I've made only one truly good sword. Still, that's enough to make people start talking. By 40, word spreads far beyond my small village. Samurai begin to show up at my door. Some noble, some desperate. They come chasing rumors, trusting their lives to the steel I shape. The pressure of that trust feels harder than diamond. During the Tokugawa peace, swords matter more than war itself. They don't just kill. They define a man's honor, his name, his entire legacy. But reputation's a blade too, it cuts both ways. My first big commission comes from a young samurai who demands perfection. For 3 months I work 18-hour days, sleeping little, eating less. When I finally hand over the sword, he inspects it in silence. A nod. A quiet, "Good enough." He pays 2/3 of the price and vanishes, leaving me with the taste of ashes and relief. That's how it goes. The hierarchy is clear. The samurai live and die by my work, but to them, I'm still just a craftsman. I make swords, but I'm not allowed to wear one. I forge the weapons of honor, but I'll never share in that honor myself. I might stand beside the lords when they visit, but I'm still the man in the soot-stained robe. I build the tools of glory, yet I live in their shadow. That's the truth of it. And sometimes shadows stretch far. One day, a sword I forged breaks during a duel. The client's family demands compensation. My name, my reputation, starts to rot at the edges. I lie awake nights wondering which mistake did it, which moment doomed that blade, and whose death will hang on my failure. But the strange thing about reputation is that it burns brighter before it fades. Word spreads even faster. Clans compete to place their orders. My swords sell in markets across the provinces. Yet with every sale comes a new burden. Each piece must surpass the last. Every edge sharper, every line purer. I chase perfection while my body crumbles. When I walk into the forge now, my apprentices bow low. They won't meet my eyes. They're terrified of disappointing their legendary master. I try to be gentler than my father ever was, but this craft doesn't forgive softness. A kind teacher makes weak blacksmiths, and weak blacksmiths make flawed swords. And flawed swords kill. So the cycle continues, pain breeding excellence, excellence breeding pain. My body pays the price. My eyes sting from the fire's glare. My skin itches from the ash that settles on everything, and my hands ache like old wood ready to splinter. My joints stiffen until I can barely grip the hammer. I tremble too much to correct a mistake. And still, despite the fame, the clients, the whispered reverence, I live in the same cramped, smoke-blackened house I was born in. The samurai who wield my blades bask in glory, but I stay hidden behind the fire and the forge. That's the fate of a swordsmith, inevitable but unseen. When I'm working on the fine stuff, my hands start to shake. That tremor ruins the tiny precision that made my name. It feels like theft, like I'm stealing the work I've spent a lifetime building, but if I don't keep going, everything I've done collapses. People start to whisper. The old man's losing it, they say. Apprentices avoid my eyes and quietly wonder how long I'll be around. Rumors are poison. Then comes a request from a high-ranking retainer. I try to do the yakiire, the quench, with hands that won't stop trembling. It goes wrong. The result is a disaster. The sword is a burden to carry, and with every clumsy breath I take, humiliation creeps closer. My career stops being a climb and becomes a slow slide. Every commission after that feels like a desperate bet with a failing hand. So I shift roles, I teach, I manage quality, I supervise. After 40 years of shaping steel with my own hands, there's some dignity in that, but it still eats at you. It's a kind of slow destruction. I remember when every finished sword pulled me into obsession, how my hands created beauty I could almost worship. Now, at 58, I can't hold the hammer steady the way I once did. Still, fate had another chance for me. A young samurai teacher came to my door. He was heading into a desperate duel and asked for my finest work. There was a mixture of honor and a kind of hopeless fire in his face that took me back to myself when I was young. I put everything I had left into that blade. I used the last of my best steel and every technique I'd sharpened over 5 decades. For a moment, my shaking hands behaved like they used to. Muscle memory and will lined up. When I finally said, "Here," the blade that came out looked like moonlight trapped in metal. The yakiire line, my hamon, was the most perfect one I'd ever made. After 3 months of suffering and obsessive work, I'd forged a sword that carried everything I'd learned in my life. Teacher took it, drew it slowly to feel the balance, and the light seemed to cling to that edge like lightning. Even the warrior, hardened on countless battlefields, gasped. He said he'd never seen anything so flawless, then bowed deeper than any samurai had bowed to me before. He promised to carry that blade to his duel. When teacher left, I felt a small, strange pride, the kind you taste only once in a long while. Then came the news he returned. Against impossible odds, he'd won. But he didn't claim the glory for himself alone. Before the Lord, kneeling in the courtyard, Tishur declared that the victory belonged not to his hand but to the master who made the sword that made victory possible. "Honorable blacksmith," he said, "this triumph is yours." He said my name out loud, that my steel had guided his hand, that my spirit had turned the tide. The daimyo, the great lord, heard it. They put my name beside the work itself. For the first time in 60 years, I stepped into the light instead of standing behind it. My name, usually reserved for legendary warriors, was spoken with respect. Poets wrote lines about the smith whose blade turned defeat into victory. While most craftsmen disappear and die unnamed, I realized then that I'd done something beyond simple fame. The warrior class I'd served for decades finally showed me honor. 3 years later, I could breathe easier. Not hidden in the shadows anymore, but wrapped in the respect I'd always earned. When I died, samurai from across the country came to my funeral. Some of them carried that last masterpiece as a tribute. New words were cut into my gravestone. A steel that had been tested by death and had engraved victory on the world. That sword will outlive me. My name will live on as legend. Sometimes, after a lifetime in the dark, even the most forgotten soul hears the light. In our land, steel can cleanse honor. In a darker room of the world, our tools chase away fear. If you can stand it, if you can endure the pain and the smoke, why not throw yourself into a life that feels like a medieval torture? Because that's what this craft asks of you. Sacrifice in exchange for the chance that one day, maybe your work will be more than just suffering. It might become something that sets a story right.